Welcome to ECR Tools. Today we are asking the question, what is a rights-based economy? This video we are making following on from our previous videos on inequalities with Adam Gorin and Sonia Agwaji and many other videos that has been made on issues of inequality. And so today, following on, we are looking at what a rights-based economy is. So the question is, what is a rights-based economy? Now, this idea, a rights-based economy, is an idea, is an economic model or an economic idea pioneered by the Center for Economic and Social Rights, an NGO in New York. And this started in the year 2020. A rights-based economy is basically an economy that prioritizes human well-being, human rights, social well-being over profits. And so the idea is to organize a society with its production, distribution, and consumption in an equitable manner that helps all peoples to live in a dignified environment. And so the idea of a rights-based economy is basically looking at the resources that we're basically producing and using, considering our needs today and also for future generations. But what is key is putting people and the planet first. And so this is what makes a rights-based economy, an idea pioneered by CESR, New York. Now, many a times, obviously in academia or in many other sort of endeavors in ideology, you always see these sort of polarized views. So whereby one, if we're talking about economic models, one may put capitalism against socialism, or against communism, or against feudalism, or all kinds of, economic ideas. And so this is where the problem is. When you're always trying to polarize the situation where it's going to be this against that. But in reality, in every society, what is key is a mixture of all these if I should say economic models, is the mixture of it. The reason is that in life itself, you have the bright, the not so bright, the weak, the strong. But we are all in one melting pot. And so the idea is not to pair one idea against the other, but to use both ideas to the benefit of humanity, and also for a care for the environment. And so, for example, you have these kinds of ideas whereby, you're talking about the economy and you're basically looking at things like capitalism and you're looking at neoliberalism. So in the past 40 years, since the 1980s, you've had the likes of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan pioneering neoliberal economic ideas, which entails the reduction of the size of the state. So since 1980, we have seen the reduction of the size of the state through privatization of state assets. So for example, you'll be looking at things like, if we should use the United Kingdom as an example, you'll be looking at things like the privatization of the rail services, British Telecom, what else could I think about? The water companies, and the energy companies. So all these institutions before were state-owned, and the state employed people to work, and these people obviously could be taxed then by the state. But since 1980, the pioneering of a neoliberal economic idea, being a very polarized view, so it sort of goes with capitalism against socialism, these ideas thrived as the right way to go. And so you find that, these state assets were sold. When you probably look into other countries, let's say African countries, you see a situation where obviously these neoliberal, I'll say, doctrine or ideology led to the sale of a lot of state assets also in the African countries through the IMF and World Bank structural adjustment policies and economic recovery programs. So, for example, if we should use a country like Ghana, for example, once again in the 90s, you could see once again the selling of state assets, which was also probably evident in the UK by, say, properties that had been acquired by the then first president of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah. Many properties were then sold to government officials and private, powerful private individuals. And so you can see a situation where assets that were for the state, for the benefit of all the nation, were then sold to these private individuals. And their aim, obviously, is mainly for profits. Notwithstanding the fact that there has been a fair amount of progress, economic progress, if we should obviously consider our living standards then and now. Obviously, many have attributed this to the system of the neoliberal economics and privatization. But other critics have said that naturally, human beings progress. Naturally, we improve in anything that we're doing. And so the argument is that it is not necessarily the fact that, state assets were then sold to powerful individuals who are now making supernormal profits and creating a huge gap of inequalities. Now, such individuals have become very powerful, even in, owning a lot of multinational corporations that, are kind of faceless, that you don't really know who they are. However, they have been in a position where they influence governments, they influence the judicial systems, they influence the legal systems. And in effect, if this trend carries on, you are going to see sort of apathy, political apathy, and a loss basically in the confidence of the state, a loss in the confidence of the judiciary systems, a loss in the confidence of the press, a loss in the confidence of the legal systems, and even a loss in democratic governance. Because in recent times, we have actually seen situations where, elections are rigged even in Western countries. We have heard instances where a country like Russia has been involved in the election or fiddling in the election processes in a country like the United States of America. And so if governments don't recover this position and rebuild themselves, basically, probably I would say we've reached an era, a post-growth era, where, states should now be thinking of recovering all these assets that they sold to these private individuals or powerful multinational corporations. Because originally the idea was that these institutions were not making enough profits, and so they felt that if you brought it into private ownership, it will. But what you find is that these institutions are, they are monopolies or cartels, and therefore they either control price or the service, or they control both. And so you tend to find that if you should use the UK as an example, you find that fares are skyrocketing, and yet you don't actually get a good service for the rail, obviously for the trains. I mean, we've had situations where even bus services have been privatized. And so what you then found is that with the years of this economic idea, which does not consider that you need to be mixing it, you need to be having a baseline. You know, for example, these institutions like the travel, obviously like the rail services, the water companies that have been dumping waste in the seas, and let's say the electric, gas and electric household utility firms that have been basically ripping people off and taking off all their disposable income. If these institutions were actually owned by the state, then one could say that the share of its profits or of its services will be of a national benefit or of a national interest rather than a private interest that is bent on basically accumulating profits and wealth above human needs and above the needs of the environment. And so this is why the Center for Economic and Social Rights, New York, are pioneering this idea of a rights-based economy, which then basically prioritizes humanity, human needs, social equity, environmental protection, and ecological protection over the accumulation of profits. What we've also noticed over the years is that if you allow this system to run, then what you get is that the private individual or the very, very few accumulate so much resources, and then they turn these resources into counterproductive activities such as wars, funding wars, and causing destructive activities to humanity. And so this is where the need is to recover this position. But what you realize is that this structure is so entrenched that coming up with an alternative economic model, such as the rights-based economy, becomes a very challenging situation, in the sense that these are called demagogues, or these private wealthy individuals that owns these multinational corporations are able to influence government because of the reduction in the size of government and the weakness within governmental systems. You will find that these institutions are bringing in their own people into governance, and then it creates a structure where those that are obviously economically benefiting from this current system will basically resist any kind of change to the benefit of all humanity. This is just common sense, and so this is what really happens. And so there is that need for that change to occur. And so if we look a little bit into neoliberal economics and private and basically capitalism, you're looking at things like privatization of state assets. Then you're looking at issues like deregulation and obviously sort of free market laissez-faire economy, where you reduce the size of the government and then you say, do not interfere. Let the forces of demand and supply operate within an economy. And so if that is the case, then the question that you put to governments is that if you want the forces of demand and supply to work without any interruption, then it's almost like you leave a country in a state of anarchy where people do whatever they want, and therefore there is no need for a government where people will then pay taxes into. Then you leave the people to do their own thing, selling and buying, and whoever is stronger or more intelligent wins. That is not the purpose of governance. The purpose of governance is to be the bridge to create laws and policies to basically create a balance. As my discussion with Adam Gorin on the issues of inequality, we came to the conclusion that it's not the fact that there shouldn't be inequality, but it is the excessiveness of the gap that needs to be bridged to basically reduce such inequalities. And so then you have things like lower taxes, obviously in a neoliberal economics, and then the concept of this perpetual growth, you know, GDP growth and profitability, and things like austerity. And so, you know, we've come to the point, if we should basically look at the data, i.e., I am going to see if I can read something here. So there is an equity trust report in 2022 that says that they have projected that by the year 2035, 200 UK wealthiest will have wealth more than the annual GDP of the United Kingdom. And the World Economic Forum report, also in April 22, also said that the bottom 50% lost 7% of their disposable income to the top 1%, basically in the period of the pre- and post-COVID era. And so this gives you an idea of the seriousness if the situation is not curbed and allowed to run free. You also have the Tax Justice Network. They also estimated that states were estimated to lose $4.8 trillion in tax revenue to multinational corporations for tax avoidance and tax evasion within the next 10 years. And so you're looking at how these sort of monies, if recovered, could go towards a universal basic income and a universal basic services. And so when you look at the universal basic services, you're looking at things to do with transport, good hospitals, good schools, obviously investment in these institutions, which creates jobs and therefore creates a tax revenue for the government. The reason why it is also necessary for governments rather than individuals to possess these powers or have these sort of economic power is the fact that if the government have these powers, the government is not run by just an individual. It is anybody have a right to educate themselves, to apply for these jobs and get into these positions, so that the situation is very open to all and it's not specifically one person or one family or a group of cronies running these sort of systems, but something that is exposed to every individual within a particular country to have benefits or to benefit from the production, the distribution and the consumption of any economy. Then the other thing that is also relevant is the fact that government can use legislation and policy and even have a global influence or a global dialogue to come up with policies that will put people and the planet first, against basically perpetual GDP growth, perpetual profitability, perpetual extraction of the limited global resources, which then have damaging consequences that if we don't basically keep a control on our level of extraction. I mean, I'll make an example. For example, in Ghana currently, under the latest government or under President Akufo-Addo, the issue of illegal mining, which is called galamsey, mainly done in collaboration with China or the Chinese government, supported by the Ghana military, or should I say security forces, have basically commenced this extensive extraction of the resources of the land. So basically, lots of illegal mining going on. Trees are being basically deforestation on an extensive level, which have then turned most of the major rivers into chocolate. So basically, you know, these mining, they're basically polluting these water rivers, major rivers, which were a source of life for, you know, communities and villages. This is actually going on currently in Ghana. And so, you know, these are some of the problems of neoliberal economics and capitalism, because it's based on, you know, accumulation, it's based on greed, is based on excessive extraction. And this, you know, governments must come together to put a stop to these things. And so the Center for Economic and Social Rights, New York, are pioneering these ideas and calling on communities that are also, you know, pioneering, because the rights-based economy, it's basically a different economic models that are pulled together. So you're looking at things like postgrowth and degrowth, you're looking at Doughnut economy, you're looking at ecoswaraj, you're looking at the Reddeal, and you're looking at feminist economy. So there are so many various localized economies or economic ideas that are currently being pioneered, but it is in a disintegrated or sort of defragmented system. And it's also a bottom-up approach, because now, as I mentioned before, the top, it is very difficult, you know, to start this idea from a top-bottom approach, even though it would have been more effective that way, because governments have the power. Governments have the power to make legislation. They have the resources to influence media, to influence the judiciary, to influence legal systems. But then, as I mentioned before, if you have a situation where, you know, these individuals or rich, powerful individuals or multinationals are putting their people into the top of governance, or basically putting their resources behind people to govern, then therefore, if you were to bring a change, the change cannot really come from the top, but it will be better if it did come from the top. It may seem that there is that sort of watered down ideas from all these big global institutions like the World Economic Forum, like the IMF, like the World Bank, you know, where these demagogues or you know, powerful private individuals are in this sort of cabal, or, you know, these sort of big, you know, secret organizations coming up with this, you know, through the IMF and the World Bank, coming up with these SDG goals and net zero, blah, blah, blah. So you hear a lot of these things. And obviously they desire to bridge inequalities and, you know, help the ordinary guy on the street. So there's a lot of rhetoric in that sense. But then the practicality, when you go on the ground, what you see is that the data is actually, if you look at pre-COVID and post-COVID, you see that the data, there is a huge shift of about 7% of the incomes of the bottom 50 to the top 1%. And so these things are there, but as we see, they are not as effective. And so this is where, when you look at, you know, the alternative economic models that supports a rights-based economy, then you are actually looking at things like the post-growth and the degrowth school of thought. Post-growth degrowth is an idea pioneered by Professor Jason Hickel. Then you look at things like Doughnut Economy, which is also the proponent is Raworth, ecoswaraj, and the Reddeal, which deals with indigenous, basically lands that indigenous peoples have lost. You know, they were the custodians and the protectors of the land, but these lands have been taken away from them. So these, you know, Reddeal are fighting for the restoration of stolen lands back to indigenous peoples. Professor Jason Hickel has been doing a great deal of work on degrowth. So degrowth is also a system whereby you're basically looking at the production, the distribution and consumption systems, you know, taking people, basically doing these things to the benefit of people rather than profits. And also looking at the waste, you know, waste in the systems, and obviously excessive extraction of limited global resources. And so this Professor Jason Hickel has been pioneering that if these things are not put to a stop, then we are looking into a bleak future, and also that future generations may suffer excessively from this environmental damage. You know, Kate Raworth of Doughnut Economics also places the emphasis of an equitable economy, or an equitable system that once again looks at social equity, looks at human needs and human rights, and obviously looks at the what we call it, planetary boundaries, i.e. in terms of how much we are extracting, and, you know, in consideration to the limitation. And so Jason Hickel, for example, in one of his books, Less is More, obviously talks about how we can live without the, you know, the excessive, you know, production, i.e., you know, I may have maybe 3 mobile phones. And the question is, or maybe I have mobile phone 1, 2, 3, iPhone 1, 2, 3, this new car, the other car, this house, you know, so many houses or flats or apartments, you know, just by sheer owning these things, but not being able to actually use them effectively. So you're looking at things like, you know, these high-rise buildings in a lot of major cities that are basically not affordable. So these are being built for investment purposes, whereas there is that complaint or the need for social housing. So you know, a degrowth or a post-growth proponent will say governments could have regulations or policies that actually forces these landlords or these wealthy landlords to basically rent these properties at affordable prices. You know, the governments can make such regulations. And so, yeah, this is what a rights-based economy is all about. We also have Dr. Claiton Fyock of Essex University, who is also a degrowth proponent, and also obviously has effectively advocated, you know, for, you know, distribution and consumption to be in an equitable manner, and advocated for a universal basic income and universal basic services within governments. But one will say is this rights-based economy a reality? Because obviously people that have been obviously advocates of neoliberal economics and capitalism are very strong, or maybe feel very powerful in their position, and tend to ignore the fact that a rights-based economy could somehow be implemented, or could survive, or could be introduced. Whereas we may not see a drastic transformation, these things could take effect. So if we were to use yesterday's budget in the United Kingdom, that is the budget of the 30th October 2024 by our current Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, who is also a former NPC member at the Bank of England. If we were to look into her budget yesterday, by her upping up the minimum wage, the national minimum wage, doing away with austerity, putting money for children with learning disability, putting money in the education systems, putting money in the UK transport systems. There were so many things that came out of that budget that really gives that sense of that slow shift, and even the consideration of renationalizing certain institutions that have gone into private ownership and yet have remained totally ineffective or costly and underserviced. And also looking into things like, regulation, bringing back regulation. There was so much said in that budget that really gives that sense that even if there isn't a drastic transformation into a rights-based economy, you begin to see after so many years, 15 years or so, a government that is willing to put the needs of people and the environment first. And the UK has always been a nation that basically adopts and pioneers new and effective economic ideas. And so we can see that there is that hope. There is that hope that a rights-based economy, or a rights-based economic model, or a rights-based economic idea could see its origins pioneered from the UK into elsewhere. And so, yes, this is it. So we hope that in a nutshell, things like, you look at the minimum wage, which is currently now set at £12.21. If you do a calculation with a 38-hour work a week, you are finding that people could now start earning something like £25,396 a year as the minimum wage, which can help effectively in alleviating poverty within the UK and also elsewhere. She also did mention about the fact that people on universal credits that are in debt, I think the debt collectors had access to about 25% of the universal credit of these poor families that Rachel Reeves has also reduced at 15%. Then obviously corporates or employers were basically called to fund a great deal of the £40 billion funds that she needed to keep this budget balanced. Certainly, former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak was very unhappy, and there was a lot of ranting from him against Rachel Reeves. But in reality, if you look at the content of the budget yesterday, and obviously the work of our current Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, you could only admire that you are beginning to see a government that is responsible, a government that has integrity, a government that has professionalism, and a government that have the needs of the people at heart. Obviously, some people are not going to be happy. It is always the case. They have had